Morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the second session that we have now on day, where there's a question of the geographic and the topographic characteristics of the land. Two engagements that are looking at it much more from a political economy perspective in terms of the different kinds of land aggregation strategies that are possible. Two questions of governance and market processes that are associated with land use transformation as urbanization happens. Now, an engagement, this kind of an explicit engagement with the question of land is very important because it sort of highlights that urban, when we say urban or when we're saying urbanization, it's a very, very place-based, situated kind of a phenomena. And it's critical to understand where urbanization is happening to understand how urbanization is happening. So I think we'll kind of engage with that question a lot across the four papers. The second common thread that I think emerges across the four papers is that there is an interest in how governance, market, and community practices are navigating the challenges that are coming up because of location, because of land. Right? And again, I want to highlight that this is very important because when you're talking about material practices, when you're talking about actual practices, how governance navigates this, how market navigates this, it is very difficult to bypass the kind of challenges that come with location. We can sometimes abstract it out in theory or conceptualization, but in practice it's very difficult to bypass the kind of concerns, the situatedness, that location, that place brings to the questions. So overall, both of these threads take us back to the central concern that we're trying to unpack across this conference, which is that the urban is not an isolated bubble that can happen anywhere. It is a very, very situated, a very deeply place-based phenomena. And we have to think about the city in terms of the city and the city region. Right, which is kind of fun. So without too much more delay, I want to start off with the first paper in the panel, which is Sarani Khatua, who will talk. Her paper is based in Kolkata.
Everybody. As it is already shown, I am not repeating the topic of my paper. Just to clarify, when Anuna Roy wrote on reframing megacity, she said she basically prefers to use the term Calcutta despite the name change. Because Calcutta, we cannot forget that Calcutta has a very long colonial history. So we cannot understand the metropolis if we don't take into account that colonial history. So my object of this paper is to, so if we go through the larger documents, the reports like world urbanization prospects and things, if we go through the larger demographic orientation of the city as a whole, as the urban agglomeration, the reports like world urbanization prospects and things, they show that Kolkata urban agglomeration has a very contained urbanization in contrast with the other mega cities. So it is actually in a 13th rank now, and which is expected to slip to rank number 16 or something like that by 2020. So it's not going to have a much larger population growth as against Delhi and things like that. But what I want to say through this is that it is not only there is an idea that Kolkata is having an arrested population at its core only. It is not true, because Kolkata is basically structured on its colonial towns and cities. They are also having a very arrested urban population as against urban population growth as against the newer periphery. So when we are talking of Kolkata, there are two aspects to the Kolkata. One, I am referring to the city, and when I am talking about the periphery, I am referring to the larger metropolitan area, and where the metropolitan area is being highly segmented on the timeline. So those which have been formed pre-independence and those which are formed after independence, and more specifically post 1990s. So I am not going to go for a review of literature because there is a huge literature on peri-urban and we have been discussing these peri-urban literatures. But at the same time, what I will do is I will go through the census data of statutory towns, census towns, formed within the metropolitan area, not in West Bengal as a whole, just to see how the statutory towns have grown and how the population in the statutory towns have grown. But also another fact is, though I am talking of the referring to the colonial towns and things, but my context, temporal context of discussion would be mainly contemporary. I'm not going to look up to what happened 30 years back or 50 years back, but what's happening to these colonial towns at present, vis-a-vis what happening to the census towns, the peri-urban growth, the new periphery which is being produced on the city region. So just to understand, the first two map I have taken directly, one from the census and then from the basic development plan, which is the first perspective plan made for the city in 1966. If we see that in 1951, it is actually the industrial belt, Hooghly industrial belt, that later formed the Kolkata-Calcutta Metropolitan District. And now even the contemporary, which is being developed by KMDA, is also structured on this basic structure of the Kolkata metropolitan map. So the expansion has happened on the yellow part. This is the rural part where the expansions has happened, but the basic structure, this is the statutory urban, this is the structure which was already there, because if we find that out of most 31 towns, which statutory towns are actually formed in the 19th century, that is in the 1854, 1866. So the main metropolitan setup is based on these colonial towns. What is happening now is that, so just to understand just two graphs, one is that based on the growth change in total workers, and the other is first is population growth and the second is total workers. I am not going to the census towns or number of increase of census towns at present. Those towns which are showing declining population or very low rate, that is less than 10% or 20%, these are actually the colonial towns. Only the Rajarhat, Gopalpur, which were formed after independence, or those exactly contiguous to the core city, are showing higher population growth. Once you are going outside and going towards the older city metropolitan areas, the population growth rate is quite low in the last decades. This was also same from 91 to 2001. But what happened in 2001 census, due to a major reorganization post enactment of 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, there was a major organization of these towns. So there was increase in area, subsequently there was increase in population. Not that the population grew, it actually the areas grew. So that is one thing. The second thing about the change in total workers, there also some of the very old towns, that is the industrial towns, have actually shown negative total workers, and others are showing very low change in total workers. Now, if I have not shown this in this slide, but if I would split this up again into main workers and marginal workers, it would show that the positive account has been actually contributed by the higher rate of growth in marginal workers. The total main workers is actually negative in many of these terms. So, this is a very short synopsis of formation of census towns, not in West Bengal, but with respect to the metropolitan area itself. What we are seeing that if from the table, the South 24 Pargana has the highest number of census towns within the new census town formed within the metropolitan area. So South 24 Pargana is also having the highest number of rural mauzas within West Bengal, and not only that, it has the highest number of census towns within West Bengal also. So both in the east, in the south, the urbanization through formation of census towns has moved towards the south and towards the east, if we want to see. And in the second map, I have actually highlighted two municipalities which were formed in the colonial period, but they have actually shown a very high growth, very high expansion in the last 2 decades, because these two municipalities are actually jutted out in the rural space. So there you have got lands where you can have access to these rural areas, which could be brought within the statutory urban. So instead of forming new statutory urban, the area has been expanded. For example, in Rajarhat municipality, there have been, it was a very small municipality when it was formed in the 19th century, but in the last 2 decades it has gone through redefinition twice to increase the number of wards, and the huge number of contiguous rural mausas have been brought, because this municipality has emerged as a very important suburb, suburban residential suburb near New Town Kolkata and near Kolkata city itself. So it has experienced huge increase in population also. So now I've just tried to categorize the basis of statutory and municipal statutory urban formation. So if we go through the colonial towns, mainly these towns were formed based on in short we can say they're colonial industrial suburbs, because pre-independence there was a huge jute industries, engineering industries, wagons, clothes and garments were concentrated, mainly jute industries. Post-independent, there was emergence of planned towns like Bidhan Nagar, Kalyani the first time, planned suburbs like this. And then there was a gradual shifting of the administrative offices from the core city to the suburban. And the other thing is that the wagons continue to be one of the most important manufacturing industry. Fifth is that residential suburb, because Kolkata and its metropolitan falls on the suburban railway system, the commuting from the railway system, and it has a very well developed ferry system. So residential suburbs emerged as a very important aspect, because commuting from the outside to the core city had been very easy. The last thing has been the gradual emergence of the software and IT industries. And post-90s, more specifically the same thing, but the special economic zones very much within the vicinity. In New Town Kolkata itself, in NKD and in New Town Kolkata development area, there are more than 2 to 3 special economic zones are there within the single development area. Now, very important point is that NKD, the New Town Kolkata development area, has been incorporated within the Kolkata metropolitan area, and it is for the first time the metropolitan area itself has two regional governance body. One is Kolkata Metropolitan Development Authority, another is New Town Kolkata Development Authority. The one thing I have kept outside that is the political decision, because for formation of statutory urbanization, state government's political decision is very important, crucial. Now the question is whether the being statutory helps. It helps, because once you have a statutory status, it helps to give access to the taxes, raise taxes, tax revenue, non-tax revenue. And as far as the statutory urban is concerned, the new towns, there is no such distinction between old towns and new towns. The municipal revival after Constitutional Amendment Act actually help reviving these older municipalities to a large extent. Before that, though these were municipalities, they were under either the government was under suspension or they were under supersession. So they were municipalities, but the municipal governance was not working. So the municipal governance immensely improved. But at the same time, if we go to the reality is that yes, the municipal government, they are actually entrusted with the municipal services and things, but one of the very important source is that taxes from rain from land. The land is actually controlled, what kind of land, whether this is actually under the control of the state government. Through the West Bengal municipal building rules and things like the state government actually interferes a lot with municipal governance. Also, what kind of municipality form, whether the municipality will be merged with another, whether there will be an aerial expansion, whether there will be a municipality is actually a decision of the state government. So this is that I have actually developed with my conversation, with my informant interviews with the communities, but more specifically with the municipal officials. And municipal officials actually actually consisted of two very important facts. One, those are elected representatives like the councillors or the chairperson of the specific municipality, and then there is the planner. Each municipality is now assigned with a planner. So once I go talk to the planners or this, you will get a very different kind of reflection of the idea. So it's like whether you are preparing city development plans, yes, we are doing. How is it helping you? There is a marked difference from what is being planned, what is being written, and what is being implemented. There is no similarity when the thing goes on the ground. So it then becomes a very political factor that what will happen and how the thing will take place. So one of the drawback of this municipal industrial suburbs are that the jute belt of the Hooghly industrial, they have been shut down. Most of the industries, most of the manufacturing industry, most of the manufacturing units of the jute belt are absolutely in the shutdown. But because industry is not within the purview or within the domain of the municipalities, so they cannot do anything until unless state government steps in, or for the public sector units, and until unless there is some form of negotiation is done between the management in the private sector with the laborers. So even if the locked mills are open, there is some settlement race, there is no guarantee that mills which is sold, the land which is sold, which will actually be replaced by another industry, because there are other residential properties. It's very frequent that the residential properties are being coming up in this productive land. So on the contrary, for the production of space in the peri-urban industry, it's very open, the aggressive real estate development, transport network development. So these things are much more rampant in the peri-urban, that is on the eastern and southeastern part. And the other thing which I want to say, that when we talk of urban, when we talk of metropolitan change, we does not look into the changes which are happening in the panchayats. So in West Bengal, the panchayat system, the panchayat governments, the rural governance itself is going through a massive change. In 2017, West Bengal panchayat building rules were actually introduced, so as to that the panchayat can actually, the panchayat system, the different hierarchies of the panchayats can actually give permit directly to the real estates in lieu of some form of tax. So this is something very important in formation of this kind of periphery. The other thing is that this eastern and southeastern margin is actually have a overlapping of industry. So it's like the smart cities, the future cities, the private cities, everything are coming up in the same area. So this is the tax revenue. I've got it from the last municipal statistics, where you will see that there is a heavy dependence on the grant. The yellow portion, which is the non-tax revenue, which is the coming from the rent from the land and things, this is actually very less in the older towns, because they are actually earning nothing. So if you go to the, these are just the images of the kind of landscape we are getting. It's a way of just to show that we are getting global and we have all the global features and things like, as against these kind of landscape which we are getting, peripheries which we are getting from the older towns. It is very difficult to distinguish it from the rural periphery and things like that. And the last picture is that of a closed jute mill, and it's really difficult to come up with one picture of this, because if you go through the Hooghly industrial belt, miles after miles you are walking, the large walls are set up, these are absolutely empty, resided or actually occupied by the jute mill workers who have stayed back, and it's something very ghostly. It almost gives a very ghost town appearance, but very much different from which is developing in China and things like that. So just to consider that though when it's happened in the last 2 decades, an immense literature has come up especially with regards to the East Kolkata development or the peri-urban development around the Kolkata metropolitan cities. Also with regards to the kind of resistances we are having, kind of dissents we are having in these areas. But what gets sidelined is many times these colonial industrial suburbs get sidelined, it goes into shadow, and not only that, it only comes into visible to the state only when the land is involved. It's like these days new types of industrial suburbs are being replaced by the real estate, and it's like, okay, you want to stay in a residential suburb which is away from the city but in the lap of nature. So it's like the jute mills are actually being replaced by these kind of residential suburbs. And also the another concern is that one, I cannot, though it is basically the land which remains very crucial to this, is about the governance structure. Though after 93 for a decade there was a rise in municipal governance, there was an immense municipal activity. Since 2010 there is a strong centralization tendency is coming up, where the municipalization is being very much controlled, or not only the municipalization, the regional governance, these metropolitan development authorities are very much within the control of state government, which is a sign of caution as far as
Good morning, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us to present this work. So what we are presenting here today, my co-author Sachin is here, and the other two co-authors couldn't make it. We are presenting here some little bits from an ongoing research project, which is called Speculative Urbanism, Land, Livelihoods, and Finance Capital. This is actually a project which we are doing with some colleagues at UCLA and Minnesota, and it's a comparative study of Bangalore and Jakarta. The overarching objective of this study, as we initially conceived it, was to understand the impacts of large-scale, high-end real estate development in globalizing cities like Bangalore and Jakarta, in terms of what happens to the immediate localities and neighborhoods where large projects are put up, and in terms of social, economic, ecological, and other kinds of consequences. And we have taken in both the cities one peri-urban site and one core city site. And in this paper, we are just talking about the work in the peri-urban, which we already had some discussion about in the morning. So I maybe should skip over this first part where I'm trying to locate the paper within this emerging body of work on the peri-urban, which most of you would be familiar with. But in that context, I've been really jumping off from the recent EPW issue that was edited by Gudarani and Das Gupta, where they employ the idea of frontier urbanism to capture what they call the heterogeneous politics of land and the remapping of the urban agrarian hinterland that is taking place across South Asia. And so they argue that it is really at this agrarian urban edge that we can best track how new geographies of capitalist accumulation become spatially fixed, and also pay attention to the various negotiations, speculations, contestations, displacements, dispossessions, etc., that occur particularly in these kind of places. So in looking at this particular peri-urban site that we've taken in Bangalore, we're very much interested in trying to understand the different ways in which, if we can still retain these categories of rural and urban, the ways in which the rural and the urban become entangled. And particularly, as Gudarani and Das Gupta also argue, that if we understand peri-urban sites as having these older agrarian histories, then we would assume that the shape that the urban takes, the ways in which urbanization proceeds in these sites, would be very much shaped by those older histories and social configurations of the rural or the agrarian. And therefore, coming to the question of land, which is one of the main focus of our research, we really have to think about the ways in which the social histories and politics of land itself imprints the ways in which urbanization happens, and also how, conversely, how urbanization reshapes the ways in which land is valued, the ways in which land and value is produced and circulated out of land. Okay, so getting down to the more empirical part of this. This is, again, a very familiar story for those of you who know Bangalore or really any other growing city. I'm just flipping the slides very quickly to show you the way in which this particular part, we've taken a southeast edge of Bangalore, the ways in which the city has very rapidly impinged into these rural areas. So, and very striking is the last few maps were like 2005, 2010, and just between 2015 and 2017, you can see the growth. So incredibly fast pace of increase in built-up area. The paper is not about how this happens or about urbanization as a kind of technical concept, but just to note that if you look at Bangalore overall and the way in which it has grown and developed in terms of urban change over the last couple of decades, one could say that a lot of it really has been driven by just a few homegrown real estate companies, which have become really major players in Bangalore and also a few other cities. And I'll come back to why that's important. According to the research design we had, we wanted to choose a site where there was a large real estate project coming up. And so we chose a place where, in fact, this is, to my knowledge, probably the largest residential complex that is being built in Bangalore. I don't want to name the place and the company and the site, but maybe those of you who know Bangalore know what I'm talking about here. So we chose this site, and we are working in 4 villages in the vicinity of this large project. And this is just a few glimpses of what it looks like, as this is, again, a familiar site from any city like Delhi or Bangalore, a gated community with more than 3,000 flats, 3,500 apartments, and something like 250 villas. And it actually occupies more than 100 acres of land. Let me go backwards. Oh, sorry. Can you? Okay. You can leave it like that. Okay, so just down the road from this, of course, because we're talking about a site right at the edge of the city, there is still rural, there is still land under cultivation, but all the other signs of kind of unplanned, what's normally talked about as unplanned urbanization on the periphery from these kind of urbanizing villages where new kinds of housing is coming up, small apartment buildings, camps of migrant workers, very rapidly changing nature of the villages themselves as farmers who have got some money from selling land rebuild their houses and start to create rental units. All of these kinds of changes are familiar to anyone who's worked in Delhi and the outskirts of Kolkata and many other cities, right? So what I want to say about this is that is to kind of trouble the kind of standard narrative which a lot of literature has talked about in terms of neoliberal urbanization, where we kind of come with the assumption that most of these changes are being driven by certain kinds of large-scale investments and kind of international, transnational financial networks which are impinging on the cities. But here I'm really interested in the kind of more incremental and ground-up modes of urbanization which are happening in these areas. And so beyond a mega project like what this particular project, the pseudonym we've given is Lakeview Haven, which do gobble up large amounts of land, the agrarian land transition is occurring in much more subtle and incremental ways, in the sense that real estate entrepreneurship works at multiple scales. So one of the main things that we've been looking at, I'll just come back to that in a moment, is the creation of layouts. This is again a very familiar pattern for Bangalore. This is just a gesture to the ecological crisis and the water crisis, which everyone knows about also. I'm not talking about that in this paper. Again, bungalows, new bungalows coming up on agricultural land, and layouts. Now, in some ways, the history of Bangalore is also the history of the revenue layout, right? But what's interesting is that we have many authorized BDA-created revenue layouts within the city. On the outskirts, there are such layouts as well, but also many unauthorized, so-called illegal or unauthorized layouts, where particularly local farmers or landlords just buy up or use their own land and convert it into these house sites for sale. And so we're trying to track this kind of a conversion and its relation, the relation between this kind of a new land market with the larger scale land market that is created around the big real estate projects. Okay, so in order to talk about the land markets, we are basically in this paper, I just used the example of two key figures from our field work, two individuals who work as intermediary in the land markets. So what we're actually trying to do in this project is to understand how land markets get created, how they're structured, and how they operate. And we do that by looking at the market not just as an abstract entity, but as something which is created and managed by particular kinds of actors, right? And then I think if we begin to look, especially at the ground level, how those markets operate, it will tell us a lot about the ways in which a land transition is actually happening. So we use the example of two key informants from our research to kind of try to unravel this story. One of them belongs to the dominant Reddy community in the two villages that we have taken up. The main landowning community are Reddys, and the second one is a Dalit from the same village. I should mention here that the two villages that I'm talking about are just next to each other, but we selected them because one is within the BBMP limits, so it was incorporated into the BBMP in 2007 when 110 villages were brought into the municipal limits. The other one is just outside, but it's still in the so-called green belt. And so that difference is really crucial to understand in terms of understanding how the land market has kind of shaped up in these two places and why there are certain kinds of differences. So I don't have huge amounts of time. I'm going to briefly summarize what we've tried to write out here about these two actors in the land market. The first one, we've given a pseudonym of Somnath, and he is a local from a local farming family belonging to Reddy community. Although his father was a farmer, he was educated, and so in most of his career he was working in jobs in the city and also started his own small business. But he became wealthy only after the city started growing out in this direction, the land market started to take off, and this is just another layout. Suddenly there was demand for land from land aggregators and real estate companies. And so long story short, he kind of got, he was engaged by a land aggregation company to aggregate the land for the project that I just mentioned. And his basic job was to persuade quite a few households, several hundred families, I believe, to sell off their small bits of land, aggregate it, and hand it over to this land aggregation company. And in the end, he managed to assemble some 140 acres of land. And so we have a lot of details in his narratives about how he did that, how he negotiated with all the different families, how he strategized, and it's an extremely interesting story, which I can maybe tell in the question in the Q&A. But the long and short of it is that without a person like this, a local person who belongs to the dominant community, who knows most of the families, who knows which families are in trouble, which families have what kind of aspirations, there is no way that the aggregator could have gotten hold of this kind of land. And so the point is that an intermediary like Somnath is absolutely crucial to the land assembly process. And the other interesting thing about him was the fact that he represents his role as one of a kind of benevolent, godfather of the village. He says he saved the farmers from potential land acquisition by the state, which would have yielded them very little money. So the market gets driven up. He negotiated a good price between 1 to 2 crores per acre for all these families. In the process, of course, he made plenty of money, and here's the BMW that he drives. But he still lives in the village, and it's a very interesting kind of dynamic to try to look at the story of a character like this, or I say individual like this, who basically acts as that fulcrum between large-scale real estate development and the land that is so desired by these companies. So then I'll quickly shift to the second character. Okay, this is just a picture of the revenue office, again a familiar sight, but he had a nice story about how he actually, to get this land, he went and collected the revenue records of all the parcels that they were interested in to figure out who owned it, and then started approaching the families, figured out all the possible claimants on each piece of land, and traced out each and every person, because sometimes even one land deal requires 10 or 20 signatures because there are so many possible claimants. So just the sheer difficulty, and I think it took him 4 or 5 years to do this, and the kinds of connections you need to have with government, low-level government offices is, a thesis in itself, really. Okay, so now we're coming to our second person, Rahul. Rahul belongs to the same village as Somnath. He belongs to the Dalit community, and he's also a land broker. But the contrast that we want to make here is in the ways in which these two individuals operate, which really has almost everything to do with their caste background. So Rahul is interesting. He's another person from the village who got educated. He had an ambition to work in the IT industry, but then his family got involved in a fight with a local ready landlord who had been engaging in grabbing a lot of land from Dalits once the land values started going up. And because he became involved in that fight, he also then became a Dalit activist with one of the Dalit organizations in Bangalore. And in that process, by fighting a lot of kind of land, what they call land grabbing cases, especially by ready landlords, he learned a lot about how land deals work, how the whole official and legal process works for land transactions. And so he makes a living as a land broker. Broker may not be the right word. He does act as a broker in small transactions of small pieces of land, but mostly he represents or helps Dalit families to file cases against landlords where they claim that they've lost their land through some kind of machination or the other. The really interesting thing that's emerging, and I think Sachin can talk more about this in the Q&A, is that unlike Somnath, who kind of acts as an individual mediator, although Somnath draws on his caste networks in order to assemble land, in order to persuade farmers to give up land, Rahul works in a very different way, in the sense that when they're going and fighting a land case or approaching the DC or some officials, he takes the help of these Dalit organizations that he belongs to, and they go as a group, and they have detailed documentation, they make a representation, and what I found very interesting is they're actually given a hearing. And so whereas you find, this is overgeneralization, but you find someone from a dominant community who is working his networks in the kind of kind of behind the table, behind the scenes influence to get things done. In the case of this Dalit person, and when they're fighting cases, they do it very openly. They confront the government authorities and the dominant caste landlords and try to make a very legal case about, in order to reclaim the land. And so I'm out of time. I'll just say one thing in conclusion, that why am I trying to go into detail in these two kinds of stories? What is it that we can really learn from looking in detail at the way in which these land deals and land transactions and struggles around land happen? This is leading towards a kind of a larger paper that we have in mind, which is to talk about caste and land, but also to talk about the question of, or to think about the question of how caste gets reconfigured or operates differently when it's mediated through land markets in the context of urbanization. Why I'm asking this question is because I'm basically a sociologist and not an urban studies person. Most of the work on caste has been located within the agrarian and the rural. There is some work on caste in the urban, but we always seem to imagine that it is something entirely different. And yet we see how closely these things are entangled. And I think if we start unraveling, these types of practices and positioning that happens through caste and around land in a peri-urban site like this, then it might tell us a lot more about larger questions about politics, land values, and so on. This is, I'm sorry, I have to stop now, but there's a really very powerful quote from Rahul when he talked about why acting collectively through Dalit organizations is so important for them in their struggles. Sorry, and some acknowledgements. Thank you.
Varun will present next. It's on land aggregation.
So, that's the title of my work. It's not a fully formed sort of work, so I don't have any conclusions yet. I just have some reflections on it. It's based in Mhalunge-Maan, which is this place in Pune. These two villages which are sitting on like the edge of this area called Balewadi, which is this very heavily urbanized area. And Mhalunge-Maan right now is still an agricultural area. There's the Bombay-Pune Expressway, which is right next to it, and there's a Hinjawadi IT Park, which is very close to it. So this area, in that sense, is sort of sitting on the edge of that urbanization. It's, it was going to happen over there anyway. And but then this town planning scheme has sort of been introduced to that area to a lot of these farmers were expecting to cut deals with these builders, but now the town planning scheme has come and not a lot of them are happy. So because some of their land is going to be taken away, and it's being touted in this way, to suggest that they're better off under the town planning scheme. So right, I'll just give a little bit of personal context of why I picked this, because so I work with the land team at IIHS, and over the last year I've been sitting in a lot of land pooling conferences where they keep talking about and proposing land pooling as this alternative to land acquisition, especially in peri-urban greenfield areas. And it was quite interesting. So I thought, why don't I try and understand what is the sort of space for public negotiation or to express consent within that, within land pooling. I've picked town planning schemes because town planning schemes is the terminology that's attached to land pooling in the Gujarat and Maharashtra context. It comes from the Bombay Town Planning Act of 1915. So despite a lot of the narrative of town planning right now, as it's suggested as like this new age silver bullet thing, it's not. It's been around for a long time. It's not been used in Maharashtra for almost 40 years. They're sort of bringing it back right now. It's being used in Navi Mumbai and over here in Mhalunge-Maan. And but it's been used extensively in Gujarat. They claim that it's been really successful. There's a paper by Darshini Mahadevia which discusses, how it deals with the equity side of it. And she also sort of alludes to this, positioning of acquisition versus, can I get the clicker? Of acquisition versus land pooling. And also it's relevant because the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs last year put out this document to conduct pilot town planning schemes and local area plans in 20 cities in India. And so town planning schemes is like this chosen terminology, which is, I think, some sort of appreciative nod to how it's been done in Gujarat. Land pooling is the term that's been used in, say, Delhi or Amravati. So that's some sort of figures, in terms of peri-urban and how that's going to be taken in by the urban areas, by the urban centers soon. Yeah, so as I mentioned, land pooling is seen as an effective tool for planned urbanization in the peri-urban greenfield areas, and local area plans are more restricted to the brownfield sites within with built-up spaces. It's also interesting because the Land Acquisition Act also categorizes urbanization as a head under which you can, assemble land. And as I mentioned, the Amravati example is also a sort of interesting example to take note of in this context, because in the Amravati example, although there are several, there's a lot of reporting on how farmers feel cheated, after participating in this scheme. It does have a very express consent requirement, because they have to enter into an agreement with the state, which is not necessarily the case for town planning schemes in Gujarat and Maharashtra. So as I mentioned earlier, town planning schemes introduced in the Bombay Town Planning Act 1915. One of the reasons, and this is like the biggest selling point for town planning schemes now, is that it's seen as, or it's proposed as this market-driven solution, and they keep using this word win-win. Every time sort of town planning, land pooling is mentioned, they keep saying it's win-win, because what they're saying is that these guys will get good value for their land. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, this is for anybody who's not familiar with a town planning scheme. A town planning scheme is basically, or it's a sort of like a land readjustment scheme, where this area gets notified as a town planning scheme, and what they do is the government sort of takes some percentage of their land and gives them back the rest of the land, which is developed land, which was earlier say zoned as agriculture, now becomes NA. They get, usually how it works in Gujarat at least is that you there's a compensation element, and a betterment charge is also levied on these landowners. The betterment charge is usually like 50% of the improved value of the developed land. In this particular instance, and that's quite interesting, because this betterment charge, there's a lot of literature on land pooling which says that this betterment charge business doesn't work out as efficiently, because the collection of the betterment charge is quite poor, and also it gets subsidized over time when it comes to actual collection. So in this instance in Mhalunge-Maan, they sort of learned from these experiences in Gujarat, and they decided that we won't do that, we'll just take a larger percentage of the land and auction it off or sell it off, or just, yeah, and that's how we'll raise money. It's seen as a best practice. So yeah, and so largely the land is supposed to be used, the land which is taken away is supposed to be used for some sort of infrastructure provisioning. There's a percentage, there's like 40% is supposed to be used for roads, 10% is supposed to be used for housing for economically weaker sections. I don't think this scheme has followed any of that, but it's hard to say, and I'll tell you why. So yeah, it's a market-based tool, and it's also seen as having like a greater scope for public consultation, because if you meet planning authorities or officers who are in charge of land pooling schemes, they'll always say, yeah, but because we are trying to give them this market rate, and in that sense, people can negotiate with us the terms that they want, the terms, the allotment of their plots, the reconstituted plots, whether it's road facing, close to certain other provisions, things like that. So they keep claiming that there's a higher degree of public consultation, and in the current urban scenario, it's seen as the only way in which sort of planned development in the peri-urban areas can take place. This is the project, and I think if I can, so this, I didn't mention this earlier. So this Mhalunge high-tech city, it's called high-tech city because this is the first of what is going to be 13 other TPS schemes, which are all on the Pune outer ring road, which is going to come up, and they All are about 700 acres. The high-tech cities is the theme for the TPS. There will be separate other TPS schemes which will be based on other themes. So this is not a very good map, but this is the only map which is available online. There's nothing on the PMRDA website, which is the planning authority which is in charge of this. That's the Pune Metropolitan Region Development Authority. So if I can just, I don't know how to point it out, but if, which one? Oh, this one. Oh, okay. This one. So this is where the IT park is located. This is the Mura River. So the yellow parts are all housing or are to be owned by the government, and the pink parts are all for public amenities. The green spaces are the green ones, and the blue one over here is the commercial space. Now this is the first or one of the first earlier maps which came out after they approved the draft plan, and it's quite interesting because I mean it's almost an aside to what I was going to sort of study, which was about the public negotiation aspect. But this is also speaks to the transparency of the entire exercise. This is the map which came out in the newspaper. There's another map which they have put up on the board, which of the main road over there which is being constructed. They put this map up for the villagers to take a look at. The survey numbers in this map and the survey numbers in that map are completely different. That means people have been allotted different survey numbers over a period of time. And I was I happened to refer to that map standing with a lot of the landowners over there, and they were quite sort of shocked because I had another map which was in this brochure, which is the same sort of thing, which has completely different survey numbers. And in this, I don't know if you can see this, there's like 13 commercial areas, and over here there's just the one. So, and that's all been done over the period of 1 year. There's these farmers aren't aware of it, so they're constantly looking for their survey number in whatever map they have, and who knows if that's where they'll end up. So yeah, so this is a little bit of the site. I had this very insightful conversation with the PMRDA chairperson, who's an IIHS officer, and I asked him, why did he pick the Hinjawadi IT Park or this sort of thing as Mhalunge-Maan as the site for this TPS. He said we want to start with the most remunerative site for the landowners because the land values there are very high. In fact, just from the announcement of the scheme, the earlier value of the land over there before the scheme was announced was about 5 lakh rupees a gunta. A gunta is about say 1,100 square feet. It's gone up to 20 lakhs per gunta, and that's within a span of 1 year, and that's just after the approval of the draft scheme. So they're thinking it'll go up at least 7 times. So and they say that and then I asked him, why not do land acquisition or something of the sort. He says that the cost of the land is a major prohibitive factor for the IT park itself. Actually, what's happened here is that the IT park is sort of like an island now, which is on the other side. There's this agricultural area in the middle, and the private guys weren't able to acquire the land because the land is too expensive. So TPS is sort of a way where the government comes and acquires the land for you and then puts it up on sale. Yeah, and so it's about 700 acres. In this scheme, as I mentioned, usually they have like a 70-30 percentage breakup. In this scheme, they have 50% of it being held by the government. The government says that 10% of that they're going to auction off. It's very heavy on infrastructure costs, so they've taken a 600 crore loan to put this in place. This scheme also seems to be of great importance in the state because the Chief Minister, the Guardian Minister have all been attending the public consultations. Now this brings me to the public negotiation aspect. The MRTP Act, that's the Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act, sort of lays down the legal framework under which town planning schemes take place in Maharashtra. And they don't really require much in terms of public negotiation. All they say is that you must hold a public consultation. And if you read the rules, it says a public consultation is just where the planning authority, the officer, gives an explanation of the tentative proposal of the scheme, and they elicit opinions and take suggestions, but it says nothing of whether they're supposed to actually take those on board, whether they're actually supposed to do anything about it. He may choose to ignore it. So there were 8 to 9 public meetings that were held in Mhalunge-Maan, and they had no minutes of any of these meetings. They had no pictures, they had no videos. They say there were 116 complaints that were registered. They say they've resolved all of them, and they say that there were 90% of the landowners were agreeable with the scheme. I don't know how they've come up with that number, but it's very interesting, that number, because when I spoke to several of the farmers, they used the same number to say that 90% of them were opposed to the scheme. So very interesting in that sense. Also, the police. So during this land survey process, when they had to figure out where the roads were, they were sort of mapping out where the roads would be and that sort of thing. There was like police presence all over the area to stop the farmers from preventing these guys from measuring their lands or whatever. So it sort of speaks to the nature of the space to actually negotiate with these authorities. Also, these guys do a very interesting thing. When they have to establish these consent sort of things, they don't do it in these public consultation meetings. They call each family individually, they send a letter, they have to go to the PMRDA office, and they all each have to sit with the arbitrator that's been put in charge of the scheme, and have to speak specifically to what their concerns are, which is kind of some sort of power dynamic playing out there. So right, these are some of the features of the land assembly under the Land Acquisition Act. So the consent requirement is pretty express over there, because you need it 70% for PPP and 80% for projects being acquired on behalf of private companies. There's also the social impact assessment, which is an interesting thing which is there in the Land Acquisition Act, because it, what the muster that it's supposed to pass is that whether this is net beneficial for the community or not, and that sort of thing is absent in a land pooling scheme. And yeah, that's there. And in also, when you acquire land for urbanization, 20% of the developed land, this sort of option is there in the second schedule of the act, because 20% of the developed land can be given back to the landowning families, but they have to pay the cost of the acquisition and the development. I don't think it's taken usually. Another interesting thing in the Acquisition Act is that it accounts for this, whenever you acquire agricultural land, there's this accounting for the net sown area in the state. So you have to make an investment, or you have to ensure that an equivalent extent of cultivable wasteland is converted to agricultural land in the state, or an investment is made to the state coffers for agricultural land. So that sort of thing is taken into account. So is land pooling that much better? So it's better in the sense, but from a very bureaucratic point of view, because a lot of these IS officers who are involved in dealing with land, they all say that land acquisition under this act is impossible. So he gave me this example of the Mumbai-Nagpur expressway, which he was in charge of. He said the cost of the infrastructure of that project was 10,000 crores. The cost of land acquisition was 20,000 crores. So he says it's impossible to do, and land acquisition is not like the better way. He says it's the only way. And he says that it's because we offer them the same terms that the private sector does. But a lot of these farmers in that area they feel hard done by, because they are all they were on the verge of like cutting deals with these builders to sell their entire lands. And the way it works in Pune is that you usually enter in these joint venture agreements where the farmer would own say 45% of the built up space. In this, now they get 50% of their land back. The extent that which the land that they have may not have value by itself. They'll have to aggregate it with somebody else, sell it, and they may not get the same sort of value because it's only 50%. And there's no provision for replacement value of the land. It's only sort of the market value. So what happens, in terms of their livelihoods and that sort of thing. Also, there's no provision for consent, express consent at all. There's an interesting story here. There's this township that's like next to the scheme, which has been carved out of the scheme, which actually prevents it from being like a contiguous sort of thing. And that landmass is land allotted for this builder, and the farmers had gotten to this agreement, and they were going to raise hackles. So the IIHS officer took a decision, and he's like, we'll leave their land out, and because they'd already gotten to some sort of an arrangement, and we'll do the rest of it. And also the negotiation of negotiation space within TPS schemes is difficult, because what happens is that once the draft plan is approved, they go in and they lay the trunk infrastructure down. And once the trunk infrastructure is laid out, your sort of negotiating ability reduces drastically. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's it. So, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, these are reflections which I've pretty much covered. So it seems more sort of favorable from a bureaucratic point of view, because my gut feeling is that because it does away with the consent clause, you don't really have to do that. You don't have to bother taking consent. You can declare, notify an area, and you can conduct these public consultations, and that's all that's required. So, and also that TPS schemes don't really take into account things like food security, or the extent of agricultural land that's being sort of brought in into these TPS schemes, which the Land Acquisition Act does. But I think that's like that's not a criticism of like the TPS scheme itself. I mean, it's because of the mode through which it's delivered is the Act, and the Act doesn't account for that, whereas in the Land Acquisition Act it does. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Now, Jeeno George.
Hi, first of all, let me thank IIHS for having me here. My paper is titled Interrelationship Between Landform Characteristics and Hierarchy of Street Network, the Case of Bangalore Region. So if you all have noticed, we see that there is a geographer in 1960, his name is Conson, and he has said that the three main elements of urban landscape are one is land use, which changes very rapidly. The second is buildings, which even though the use changes, physically it will be there for a longer time, but it is the street networks or the streets which stays there forever. Like once you set a street layout, it is there forever. So here in the case of Bangalore, if you see, this is a set of roads that is there currently, and you can notice that the same set of streets has been there from 1850. So this is what arose my curiosity, and I wanted to know what could be the reason behind it. So we came across a law by Adrian Began. He is working on this law called as the constructor law, where he says that constructor law commands that things should flow in configurations that flow more and more easily over time. So he has used this law to simulate flow systems, and he has found out that this, if you use the law, both for the animate and also for inanimate objects, the flow you can generate the flow system using this law. So the basic principle is that the flow should be in such a way that it will facilitate easy access. So that is in case of streets. So searching more on this literature, I found out that there is another work by Guririo. It is a master's and later her PhD thesis, where she looks at the structuring lines of the territory. That is the ridges, the drainage lines, and the contour lines. And then she sees how, especially this is mainly for natural cities, that is cities that have grown spontaneously over time. She has found out that the points where the ridge lines or the drainage lines are meeting, or where they just branch off, these are the points where the activity centers are located, and these are also the points which more or less line up with the road network. So I wanted to see whether this is applicable in case of Bangalore. So the main objective is how does the structuring line influence the formation of the road network, and which in turn influences the activity centers. So here the first work was to extract the ridge lines and the drainage lines. So using the digital elevation model, I could extract this. So the red lines are the ridge lines and the blue lines are the drainage lines. And then when I interposed it on our OSM maps, I found out that in the case of the red lines, that is the ridge lines, it coincides with the major activity nodes of Bangalore, especially all the activity nodes of the earlier age, like the Bangalore Palace, the IISC, then Baswangudi, Jay Nagar, both the residential and also the marketplaces can be found out just using these nodes. And in the case of blue lines, which is the drainage lines, where the points are diverging, as expected, it is the places where the major lakes are located. So, and in the case of streets, when it is found out that 17% of these points, that is the points where the ridge lines and the drainage lines diversify or where they end, they coincide with the primary street network for 17%. It might not be the case for the secondary road network, because it is not always that the city is not a tree. It follows a semi-lattice structure, like taken from Christopher Alexander's work. So it might not be same because of non-availability of data. I could not do the second level, but first level it clearly shows that they are coinciding with. So here these are the points which coincides more or less with the major roads of entire Bangalore region. So that's it.
Size presentation, Jeeno. So just in terms of like logistics, what I want to do is maybe give a quick set of comments and just a few sort of provocations for conversations with the panel to begin with, and then I'll open it up for questions to the floor, take about 3 or 4 at a time. So I will start with Sarani. Sarani, in a very interesting presentation, and especially like taking a view from the periphery into the city and looking at these statutory towns. I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about if you look beyond the statutory and the demographic in terms of these towns. What does your work, I mean, how can we use your work to sort of fundamentally question how the question of urban governance needs to be thought about separately, like, you know, differently, like the challenges that kind of emerge from this kind of a constellation of statutory and demographic growth, which is also becoming part of the metropolitan region. Yeah. So maybe I'll just do all the questions at one go, and then people can answer together. Carol, Sachin, again, really interesting work and much to think about in there. I was actually really moved by how you ended the paper, in the sense that this is going to be an interrogation of how caste is reconfigured via land. So sort of taking that sort of a provocation into it, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about how this kind of a land value transaction that is playing out via these intermediaries and these new real estate market practices in these areas, how is that going to reconfigure what we understand as the social terrain of the urban, especially the evolving urban in these peri-urban areas? Varun, again, lots to think about. There's lots of sort of configurations there. And we discussed a little bit in the beginning about thinking about the spectrum that exists from urban, peri-urban, and the rural. If that kind of spectrum, not just in terms of like all the differences that exist, but sort of the political terrain that this also represents in terms of the pragmatic politics of participation that becomes possible in each of these locations. I think you've spoken about that a little bit already in your presentation, but if you can elaborate on that a little bit more. And also, since there was this question of the land value leverage taking these different forms, that may be more land, less compensation, if you can also speak about that, how participation then becomes, you know, sort of a modality of transacting land value or leveraging land value. Right? So basically participation as a way into the land value question. Yeah. Jeeno, thanks. That was really concise sort of a way of thinking about the city. Again, I want to provoke you to think about that. A lot of what you showed us of the Bangalore area is also what we understand as urban Bangalore. Now, if we sort of extrapolate this kind of this morphology that you're talking about into the peri-urban and the rural as well, then if you can elaborate a little bit about how this, you know, what is the relationship between the terrain and the very different political economies? If you've had a thought, you know, if you've thought about that or you've encountered that in the differences, like you've said, 17% sort of configures along those lines, but there's a lot that configures, and if you've had some thoughts about that, if you can tell us a little bit about that, right? Respond to this and then open it up to the floor. So.
First of all, my work is entirely beyond the demographic. It is just to give a consolidated view that there is a periphery which is declining. So we have an idea that the core city of Kolkata is declining and the periphery is flourishing. It's just to give a consolidated view that it's not about one town or two towns. It's about almost 31 towns, except one or two ones like that. So the actual periphery on which the metropolitan area was being developed is actually declining, where we are having a different form of construction of periphery nowadays. So my section, my work actually revolves around the governance of the periphery, where municipal governance as well as the panchayat governance, the regional governance of the city comes, and intricately linked with the land question. So land question is not only important with regards to the peri-urban areas, but also with regards to whenever I'm going to these older peripheral towns. The second section which comes up is how the dissent or the protest or the resistances which are coming up. These are the stories which are very much undocumented as far as these older peripheries are concerned. So when we talk about, there are huge literature on Rajarhat. Every year we have some form of thesis submission on Rajarhat land protest, Shingul land protest, and things like that. But every municipality, every older municipality, newer municipality, if they have some form of land conflicts. So these often go unnoticed. So these are the things which also I want to take out. And the another thing is that in form of governance, what are the stand of these planners? Because once there was a revival of a municipal government, there was, I just mentioned that there was a spark in municipalization, and now there is a change, there is a centralization again coming back. So when I go to talk or when I go to interview to the municipality, there is two distinct different types. The elected representatives, it's a very happy situation, everything is good, everything is happening, we are having that. When we are going to talk to the municipal officials, it's in the first stage, yes, we are doing this. Once it warms up, then he comes up, the planner comes up, what kind of problems he or she is facing or things like that. So especially how that is, the governance of periphery is also related with this kind of details. It's there in my larger work.
Thank you. As I said, this is actually just the beginning of a paper or an argument that we're trying to form, because so much of what we're seeing has come out of fieldwork rather than us going into the field with this question. But just a couple of things. One is that I forgot to mention is, one of the obvious things about land and caste is the political nexus, right? So in the villages we're working in, the Reddys are almost 100% aligned with the BJP, and they're able to do this kind of land grabbing precisely because they take support of political leaders. Sometimes they do it on behalf of politicians. And that land politics nexus in Bangalore is already well known. What we're trying to look at is how that is also mediated through caste, and that's a kind of obvious thing. But on the other side, I was looking for other studies that look at the involvement of Dalits in land struggles. And there is some work that looks at how Dalit organizations have been important in allowing, say, informal settlements in the city to remain in place. They're highly organized, and they also have their own kind of political connections. And yet that, so the difference, they have some amount of ability to assert themselves in this space, but I think probably decreasing, precisely because through these kinds of caste and so other types of social networks linking into the big developers, who in turn are linked into larger kind of financial networks, the space for that kind of contestation is probably getting, is shrinking. And at the same time, we find more and more money circulating through these networks. So I guess it's not just about land and caste, but it's also about finance capital, and the ways in which new kinds of money is reinforcing caste power of certain kinds, and then maybe creating new kinds of contestations. Sachin, do you want to say anything?
So if I understood the question, and specifically how land transaction changes the value in terms of caste configuration. So basically, so it's historically Dalits, between Dalits and the Reddy, how land transaction happen, and what is the status, what is the land holding at present in those villages by Dalits and Reddy communities. So the question is that, so most of the Dalits have lost the land before 2000, before real estate coming into that area. And so who are selling, who are buying the land? The Reddys. And traditionally they are the one who are land holding and aggregating, and after real estate coming into that area, that locality, they are the one who had most of the land. Dalits had around like 5-10%, that's it. And 90% of Dalits sold their land before 2000 to the Reddy and local other dominant caste through various means and ways, and interactions within the community and land and politics and society and all. So I guess that that question, it doesn't arise after this village coming into the BBMP and real estate and the land aggregator and bankers coming and aggregating the land through dominant caste, because the landholders are from the dominant caste, Reddys and Kuruvas and other. So Dalits are now the landless and so very marginalized, and now they want to survive in that real estate, and it's very different story altogether. If we can discuss later in detail. Yeah.
So your question was about what is your ability to participate or negotiate based on where you're placed in that peri-urban rural spectrum. So I can't answer for the rural because I'm not aware of it, but I'll speak for the peri-urban and you can conjecture a guess for the rural. So in that sense, because so these guys are also, they're all farmers, all of them, but their farmers were sitting on the cusp of urbanization. So they're all ready to give up their agriculture. They are very aware of what land value is. So which, as you know, one of those farmers was telling me, if this was say 20 years back, the way that a builder would cut a deal is he'd come there and he'd say, oh, you know, how he goes about sort of calculating the land value. He's like, okay, you're growing such and such crop. This is how much you're getting for it. You know, this is the agricultural land value. I'll give you plus 20% on this. Whereas now they're very aware of, you know, in terms of FSI and TDR, what their land is worth. So in that sense, yeah, these farmers are in the position in peri-urban areas, because they're so aware. They will ask for a better you know, compensation. There's a very interesting story and about why some of these farmers have a grouse against this TPS, because the IIHS officer who's in charge of the PMRDA, when the PMRDA was established, had come to them just to lay a road in that same area. He said, I just want your land to lay a road. I'll give you 15 lakhs a gunta, which at that time was okay, was slightly above the market value, and they were agreeable to it. And in fact, that is exactly what they wanted. They just wanted a road, because their land values would go up. They didn't have to give away 50% of their land, and you know, they could have charged pretty much what they'll charge now, but with only 50% of their land. But that, you know, and they said okay. And then he went back, and then he comes 2 years later with a TPS. So in that sense, and that's why they have a problem with it, but they're also very aware of it. So I could say that it's sort of like a knowledge or an information based thing. Yeah.
So in my study, I have taken both the urban, Bangalore urban, and also the Bangalore rural periphery. So in the rural periphery, out of those 9 or 10 nodes that is identified in the structure plan, almost 5 of them can be identified using this. So they fall on, they like Chennapatna, Ramnagara, Devanahalli, Kanakpura. These are all places which are along the or at the point where the ridge lines diversify. So these are places which is sustainable in terms of the geography of the place. So it is important that we identify or we improve these places, because as we have seen, it's the road which always increases the value. But where should the road be laid out? It is the it should be the responsibility of the authorities to lay down the infrastructure first, so that there is sustainable development, especially in the urban peripheries and also in the surrounding rural areas, so as to deflect the population towards the urban area. So that is also, so I have taken the entire rural area, and so this is one way of finding out where the infrastructure should be concentrated, considering the natural territory or the natural system of the region.
To some questions. So maybe the 3 hands over here first. Okay, and one over there.
I have a question for Sarani. I was actually wondering, because you were talking about in your response how municipal officials were giving you a certain narrative of decline, and that from that you are making the argument of peripheries being declining. I was just wondering, what is their, how do they put this narrative of decline? What is the, how are they articulating this kind of decline in peripheral areas? As for the second presentation, I was actually I had 3 sort of related questions. Gavin, you were talking about how about the 2 villages and how one is within the DMP and the other is outside. How does that affect the sort of land markets and caste relations that you were speaking about? And Sachin, you were saying about how there's a slightly longer history of speculative urbanism in some sense, because Dalits had been selling off land. So in some sense, they are becoming landless. They were becoming landless prior to 2000s. So I was just wondering, what is this history of? Is there a longer history of speculative urbanism that's happening in this? And the third question is about the articulation of the Dalit identity in trying to sort of argue for a greater share in land markets. Traditionally, we think of Dalit articulations in the sense of rights and justice, etc. But this is happening on a register of real estate. So I'm just trying to, I'd like a little more elaboration on how this Dalit articulation is happening in terms of give us better profits or less.
To Carol, Sachin and Varun, I was struck by how much your presentations spoke to each other. And in a manner, I think the work performed by the likes of Somnath and Rahul is analogous to what is being done by the state. You know, whether it's town planning, whether it's through land pooling or land acquisition, the state becomes that mediator. So I was wondering for Varun, if you saw in Pune where the state was carrying out this function, whether those networks of caste, power, marginalization, etc., whether those issues continued to persist, or whether everybody was more sort of similarly or neutrally affected because the state was being a mediator, whether these networks continued to play into that. And to Carol and Sachin, I was wondering whether the likes of Rahul would perhaps see the state as a fairer player in this kind of exercise, right? Where they don't have to be subject to the disadvantages of networks of capital. Because it was interesting to see how even in their interaction with the department or with politicians, Somnath was basically using networks, whereas Rahul and the others were making rights-based claims as a collective of individuals. So I was wondering if they would see it fairer when the state was doing this kind of exercise.
Thank you for those presentations. I think it speaks to the problematic of urbanization in India, all the presentations, particularly in terms of the fact that parastatals are the major interveners in how cities are evolving, despite efforts in the constitution to try and devolve planning functions to the local. And obviously nothing of that is actually happening 20-30 years later. And this kind of evidence actually strengthens the view that the politics today is shaped by parastatal-driven planning processes. And when finance sits on top of that, democratic control of resources collapses. So what is the way out of this conundrum?
I think I have just a quick clarificatory question to Carol and Sachin. So I'm not sure about the legality of it, so I was just wondering if you can just tell us about that. The SC land cannot be transferred to non-SC. So I was just wondering, because in Rajasthan that's a very important site of contestation. And we're also talking about finance capitalism, and in the previous presentation we talked about trust and technology. The capital will use all kind of big data, small data, everything to have that trust. So they will not have a legal ambiguity on which to build their plans and everything. So I understand. So what happens when I think the Dalit land cannot be sold to private aggregator? So what happens to that? And if it's being grabbed, if it's grabbed, then it becomes a legal ambiguity. Is the finance capital comfortable with that kind of legal ambiguity?
Okay, I'm just going to have one more question because I picked on Nilanjan, if you can get the mic over there as a part of this round, and then we'll take a second round if there is time.
My question is to Varun. Back at our institute, we last 2 months ago, we did an exercise specifically for local area planning in a peri-urban area. So we sort of found out many land management and land transaction options in which we looked into TP scheme as well. So I would like to just put across a query or a big major problem that we were facing, like for an area in context of Bhopal city. I know you won't be able to relate, but just to give you some contextual thing, a piece of land which has just been added into the municipal corporation boundary, which does not have any census data, any forecasting, and is a prime land for real estate as well. And that peri-urban area or that village already has a urban village and sparse development, and we have to develop that parcel. So what mechanism do we actually take up in that matter where there is an existing fabric as well, and we have to integrate it so that it does not grow abruptly or in-proportionate in terms of land use or anything? So we looked into TP scheme as well, but there were a lot of problems with land ownerships and the proportion in which the land should be reconstituted or what. So I just wanted to know if you could suggest something.
Hello. Actually, from the point of view of the planners, I was indicating about the decline in municipal governance, the municipal environment, not the decline of the periphery. So that the municipal governance that was actually created in the 90s, it was there, that excitement, that environment was there initially for past 5 or 7 years. So gradually it is declining. Just what he is saying, that there is a local self-governance. The very idea of the local self-government is to provide autonomy to the local self-government is very much declining. At least as where I work, it is very much there. So that is kind of something which is coming up from the municipal planners and officials. If you go to the municipal chairman or if you go talk to the elected representative, what happens now, you know very well that nothing in West Bengal happens beyond party politics. So if the same party is in the local self-government as well as in the state government, it's the same party, so he will say everything in coherence with what the state is saying. So if everything is happening, everything is good. But when you talk to the municipal planners, first they will say that these are the projects we are doing, these things, very technical. Then they will come back because the planners are entrusted with preparing the detailed project reports if some project comes, talking with the slum people and bringing up the plans, preparing the city development plans and like this. But when it's coming to the implementation, then the chairman is influencing. For instance, if you are planning which are the areas or which are the wards which need that project, the fund from the project most. But the fund may go to some place where the municipal chairman is actually also elected from the same board. So that the fund will actually go to that ward which belongs to the chairman. So these types of things are coming up, that these types of grievances, these are very small narratives, but at the same time they make it clear, please don't say which municipality, because once you know the municipality, you know the plan. So please don't bring my name or something. And this is irrespective of the old municipalities and the new municipalities. I've been to the new municipalities, I talked with them. This is the same thing, this is the same stiff. They are saying that they are in a very suffocated, stifling situation. Where you are working, you are doing the entire paperwork, but you know whatever you are doing that may not go. It will only go to the ground once it is in conformity with the state government or once it is with the conformity with the party interest and things like that. So that is what I want.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to club up maybe some of these questions. About the articulation of Dalit identity and the relation with the land market. Certainly, they see the state as more fair, and they do make claims in the name of social justice and rights, and which is why they use the organization and its facilities to go and make a very kind of formal claim. They gather the paperwork, they approach the DC, and they have all their evidence, and they make very formal claims to show that some land has gone out of SC hands into some other person's hands. And then the link question is, how is it possible? Well, it's possible because the Reddys, I don't want to keep taking name of Reddys, but let's say powerful people have ways of manipulating land records. And if you want to show that a piece of land that was once upon a time assigned land or grant land and is now in the hands of some individual non-SC person, you have to do a whole lot of digging, which is very time-consuming and costly. And yet, Rahul and people like him are doing that and taking cases forward. I'm not sure about whether finance capital is comfortable with that. I think some of the land that's gone into this big project actually is under contestation. And I don't know what will happen now that the villas have come up, if the courts finally decide that that land should not have been sold by that particular person. We have to look into some of that stuff. But it's an interesting question. I think I'll give it to Sachin to answer the rest of it. But the larger kind of framework from which I was coming when we started looking at land here was that so much of the literature on land, on the land problem in India has been about compulsory land acquisition, and we always seem to think that that's how land goes from rural to urban, or infrastructure is through state action. And yet clearly more and more it's the market that's doing this, and that's obviously a deliberate policy shift which the land pooling and so on are trying to structure in some way. So we were interested in actually how are these markets operating, but obviously there is a larger state framework that is enabling this and that is directing it in certain ways, and which also therefore allows for certain types of actors to benefit more from those markets than others. And there's plenty of studies that show that. And I think that kind of links to Leo's question about the parastatals. Again, there's so much that gets decided at a level which is much beyond what any researcher can access. So even we were talking yesterday at lunch about the master planning process, the 2031 plan. I mean, we know for a fact that developers go to BDA and KIDB, et cetera, and make deals, right, about zoning and so on. And yet there's no way you can really show that. And we have a piece of land, even in our area where we're studying, where we know that it's probably going to get zoned differently in the next plan, and already people have dibs on that land. But when it comes to kind of research, it's really hard to kind of write about that because it's all behind closed doors. And so I think just going back for a minute to the question of the Dalits is that yes, they are still making kind of it's a political and a social struggle on the basis of rights. At the same time, people like Rahul are trying to find a foothold in that market because they also know that basically how do you make a livelihood anymore? There's no agriculture, it's very hard to get a job in the city. And basically, being a land broker and being some kind of a actor within that market at least provides some kind of a hope of some income. And yet they're on a completely different level from someone like a Reddy or these big land aggregators who are completely differently placed in order to kind of accumulate value from these kind of transactions. I had a comment about land pooling, but maybe we can come back.
Sure.
To your question, so how does what is the how the land values as compared to the green belt and yellow belt, or panchayat or BBMP? So there is a influence on the green belt when 110 villages brought under BBMP. So suddenly land value rose. In green belt area, because it is adjacent to BBMP and yellow belt, so land value has also increased. And if I give a number like 30-40 site, cost around 18 to 20 lakh, and many layouts have come up because that area is adjacent to the BBMP limit and so in terms of caste, like how it is influencing, and why we should ask about caste thing. Basically, so in both villages, green belt and yellow belt, Dalits have lost, traditionally, historically, Dalits have lost land to dominant caste. So the majority of land holding is with dominant caste. And few like 10% Dalits have still land in green belt and yellow belt. But in yellow belt they have sold to the real estate, some real estate. And then green belt, still they have land. Some of them are doing agriculture, and some they are, still holding land. When there will be a lifting of zoning, they might turn into the real estate and they might sell it. So the second question, so the history of Dalit and losing land to the dominant caste. So it's very much connected to festivals, marriage, like within village. So traditionally they were doing village festivals, Urhabba. So there is a lot of story around that. If I talk one incident, like how Dalits lost land to the Reddy. For instance, village festival. For village festival, for Dalits, like who is spending more money in that village festival? So if I talk to the people, it's Dalit who are spending more money in the village festival, because they have to do all kind of sacrifice and invite. So that story is there. That's why like the festival is there, marriage is there, distress in agriculture, and going to the Reddy dominant caste and asking money from there, and they lend money to Dalits, and that back and forth interaction within the community, and losing land to the Reddy dominant caste is there, like traditional, and we are still tracking that entire history of how Dalits and dominant caste interacted in terms of land purchase and selling. Yeah.
Yeah, so your question about how identities sort of factor in this negotiation process. So in my experience and in my interaction with the landowners, I didn't see caste as such a massive factor, but that's just based on their responses. Like they didn't allude to caste. So I'm guessing that that's not part of the equation. But there are two other sorts of identities that do play a role. One of those is in terms of how long have you been residing in the village. So if you're a new entrant and if you were there earlier, and the other one is in terms of your access to say some sort of political representative. So there are those two identities which do have a significant impact on your bargaining power with the PMRDA. But yeah, women are not part of the equation at all. So neither do they attend the meetings, nor are I don't think there are landowners, yes, on the record, but I don't think any of them attend the meetings. I never, even in the families that I did meet, I never spoke to any female members of the household. So yeah, they're just not there. Yeah.
I know, thank you so much for all the presentations. I think it's provoked a lot of thoughts, and I know that there are a lot of other questions that are still there in the audience. But just because we are now sort of beyond the 1:30 limit as well, and now sort of eating into the lunchtime. So please find the panelists during lunch and ask the rest of the questions. But I really want to thank you all, because this was a lot of very thought-provoking set of ideas here. So thanks.